So one of the perennial questions in political philosophy is how individuals should relate to the political communities they inhabit. That's one of the issues that get asked in new and very exciting ways in ancient Greece, and then remains a staple of reflections about politics and worries about politics in Western thought. And Plato and Aristotle offer two fascinating and consequential and problematic treatments of that issue. So Plato, easily the most famous philosopher from ancient Greece, and his most famous dialogue is the Republic, and probably the most famous thing about the Republic is his kind of picture there of what an ideal city looks like, what an ideal polis looks like. And one striking aspect about his kind of construction of the ideal city is what people have called the principle of specialization. So the basic thought behind that principle is that each citizen is going to perform one task and only one task in the ideal city, the task to which that citizen is most naturally suited, right? So being a farmer, being a soldier, being a ruler, whatever else, being a trader, whatever else. And part of the thought there is that this will be the most efficient way to run things, right? So if you're only doing the one task to which you're most naturally suited, that your nature inclines you to pursue the most, and things will work in the most efficient manner. It's never very as explicit as we might like it to be, perhaps, precisely how the appointment happens, or how that happens in practice. But the basic thought is that there's a rigorous, comprehensive education system in the city, and as children and then all the children go through this system, their talents start to show, right? And their limitations start to show, and they get channeled in different directions. So, like many aspects of Plato's construction of the ideal city, this idea of specialization is very untypical, unconventional. If you take the army, for example, typically in Greek cities, the army would comprise of citizens who also had other day jobs, as it were, right? So you take farmers, etc., and they would comprise, the soldiers for a military campaign. In the ideal city of Plato's Republic, it works differently, right? The army is a professional army. The soldiers only soldier. They don't also try to farm, etc. Now, in many ways, this kind of idea of specialization, the idea that the city is going to channel you towards, the vocation that most suits your talents, is kind of deeply shocking for us, right? We like to think that perhaps we can do more than one thing, or change our mind about what we want to do, and self-determination, of course, is very important for us. This idea does have at least a couple of really interesting, thought-provoking consequences, though, in the Republic. So one is that it leads Plato to divorce wealth from political power, right? So if someone is naturally suited to being a ruler, that's what they're going to do. They're not also going to be a moneymaker, right? And the thought there, part of the thought there is, look, if you want to be a focused ruler, right, and that's your job and that's what you do, then you need to focus on that, on developing the well-being of the city, promoting the well-being of the city. You can't also be worrying about lining your pockets, right? Those two things are bound to conflict, right? So he actually has this very stringent, striking kind of set of restrictions about the lifestyle of rulers, right? So they're only going to have a modest stipend from the city. They're not allowed to accumulate wealth beyond that. They're going to live together in this kind of camp-like sort of environment. So that's one interesting consequence. And he's not shy about trying to elaborate the political attractions of that beyond the efficacy of rulers who only focus on ruling. So, for example, part of the thought is that in this way we're going to eliminate competition within the elite ruling class, right? You're not going to have competing ruling families trying to grab power so as to advance their, you're not going to have competing ruling families trying to grab power so as to advance their bottom line. Right. That kind of competition is going to disappear. You also, or so he hopes, you're not going to have resentment from the non-ruling class towards the ruling class, because it's not going to be the case that the rulers also have this grand, ostentatious lifestyle. Actually, being a ruler is going to be a very austere, kind of self-denying job in many ways. So that's the hope, that it's going to engender harmony within the ruling class and harmony across the classes in the city. And so that's one consequence, separating wealth and power. Another really interesting consequence has to do with gender politics, right? So, if we ask what kind of nature does a ruler need to have, so Plato's answer to this is very complicated. I don't want to get into it too much, but essentially, the bottom line is that a ruler is going to be a kind of ideal philosopher, someone who has the right kind of knowledge about the nature of justice and the nature of the good, and tries to apply that knowledge in a political environment. And they have other qualities like tenacity and a love of truth and stuff like that. But Plato then asks himself, all right, so is there anything about being a man or a woman that's a requirement for having some of these qualities? His answer is no, actually. And if you think about the nature required for being someone who's naturally suited to ruling, if you try to specify that kind of nature, you're not going to make any statements that have to do with someone's gender. Right? And he imagines an objection where someone says, well, hang on, you said that different natures are suited for different things, but men and women have different natures. And his answer is, but they're not relevantly different, right? It would be like saying, oh, bald people and people with long hair have different natures, so one of them should be a ruler and the other one shouldn't be. It's an irrelevant difference. Right? So at least interesting consequences of this principle of specialization, we end up divorcing wealth and power, and we end up with, again, very controversially, very unconventionally, a system where you can absolutely have female rulers.
What happens to people who don't have the capacity to be productive in this system?
That really interesting point, yeah, and this is one of the moments where, again, Plato's political ideas become quite shocking for us, perhaps, and I don't want to sugarcoat it at all, right? And he's actually quite explicit about this, and we're not just going to prolong the life of people who are not able physically to be productive in the city. He's quite explicit about that. He's quite critical of this attitude that people who have long-term chronic, the kind of long-term chronic physical problems that prevent you from being productive, that we're just going to prolong your life anyway. No, you have to be productive, right? So the city isn't going to just prolong the life of people who can't perform one task in the city. And he compares the phenomenon of drones, so unproductive bees in a beehive, and he says that drones would be the greatest, drones in a city would be the greatest evil. Actually in a city. And why would it be the greatest evil to have citizens going around who don't have a job, don't have a task? Well, part of the thought seems to be, that ends up generating a kind of boredom, a kind of frustration, a kind of resentment that ends up spilling into subversion and tension and eventually revolution. Right, so very good question, and yes, this is one of the aspects of the Republic that perhaps is quite uncomfortable for us. So the bottom line of all of this is that there is a meaningful sense in which in the Republic we think about the happiness of the city first of all. Right? We try to make the city as a whole as happy as it can be. And the happiness of the citizens is a consequence of that, right? Of the individual citizens. That's a consequence of living in a flourishing city, in a happy city. But Plato is quite explicit that we're not going to try to make any one individual as supremely happy as possible. We're not going to make any one class as supremely happy as possible. And the rulers are a nice example of that, because these are people who are, what they really want to do is sit and philosophize. They don't really want to rule. And that's part of why it makes them attractive rulers, right? Because you want rulers who don't really want to rule. And because if you really want to rule, then you're too ambitious and you probably wanted to promote your own good, etc., individual self-good, etc. So you actually want rulers who don't want to rule, but that means that they're kind of spending their time doing something that, ideally they wouldn't really want to do, right? In a perfect world, they could just sit and philosophize. They're going to rule because they know they should, and it's a just thing to do, and that makes for a happy city. But again, we worry about the happiness of the city first, and the happiness of individuals and individual classes second.